Okay, hello and welcome everybody to this session of the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy, where we discuss a pre-circulated paper on Fichte's method. So I'm very happy to welcome our two speakers today, Marina Bykova and Christian Klotz. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and then we'll have a short introduction to the paper from Marina. We'll have a response from Christian, a counter response, I guess in very Fichtean fashion from Marina, and then we will open the floor to questions. So it is a discussion of a pre-circulated paper. It's available on our website, and I think it will be in the chat if you want to download it to refer to it. And we will afterwards leave the session open for an informal chat if anybody wants to stay. And if you have questions during the Q&A, there it is, it's in the chat now, the file. If you have questions in the Q&A, just use the raise hand function or send me a message or raise your physical hand and I'll call on you in the order that I see your hand. And if I could just ask everybody who at all can to turn on their cameras so that we can all see each other and reproduce real life setting as much as possible. Okay, so without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome Marina Bykova, who is professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University. And she's also editor-in-chief of the journal Russian Studies in Philosophy. Before joining North Carolina State, she held posts at the Institute of Philosophy of the Russian Academy of Sciences, at Moscow Lomonosov University, at the University of Cologne and Marburg, University of Zurich, University of Vienna, and Ohio State University. Her main research interests are 19th century continental philosophy with a focus on German idealism and theories of subject and subjectivity. I'll just mention a couple of her relevant publications. One is the edited volume Bloomsbury Handbook of Fichte, which was released in 2020. And the article from 2010 called The Self as World into Itself Towards Fichte's Conception of Subjectivity, which was published in the volume Fichte, German Idealism and Early Romanticism. And her talk today is on a chapter entitled Fichte's Original Presentation of the Foundational Principles of the Wissenschaftslehre, the Question of Method. Okay, so after Marina's brief introduction, we'll hear from Christian Klotz, who is professor of philosophy at the Universidad Federal de Goiânia. I think that's how it's pronounced. Before taking up this post, he was at Humboldt Universität and the Universidad Federal de Santa Maria. His areas are Kant and German idealism, with a focus on metaphysics and theory of knowledge. And specifically, he's interested in the themes subjectivity, transcendental speculative logic, and monism. I'll mention a couple of his publications. There's the article Substance and Subject from Kant to Hegel, published in 2020 in Studia Kantiana, and the article entitled Fichte's Explanation of the Dynamic Structure of Consciousness in the 1794-95 Wissenschaftslehre, which is in the Cambridge Companion to Fichte, published in 2016. Okay, so without further ado, I hand the floor now to Marina. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first, thank you to Karen for inviting me, and to Pavel and Lewis as well, who organized this colloquium. So this is really very nice opportunity for everybody to get together, even if this is via Zoom, and exchange the ideas. And thanks a lot to Christian for agreeing to comment on my paper. So first, I will say a couple words, so maybe if you allow me, maybe a little bit longer than 10 minutes, or maybe up to 15 minutes or so, to introduce some main ideas of my paper, and then I will be happy to respond to Christian remarks and then your questions as well. So Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre is an attempt to complete the project of scientific philosophy formulated by Kant. Fichte takes it upon himself to develop a philosophical system that would meet the demands of rigorous science. Thus, questions of methodology become an urgent matter and move into his focus. My interest in this paper is the style of presentation, or if you'd like, so form of exposition, and the method of philosophizing employed by Fichte for the purpose of the explication of his foundational principles in the 1794-95 foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. In this and other early expositions of the Jena Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte associates the methodology of his systematic presentation of philosophical derivations with the method he describes as synthetic. Yet by a closer consideration, it becomes apparent that Fichte's employment of his method in 1794-95 presentations of the Wissenschaftslehre is not coherent with Kant's method of the same name. Furthermore, there is no consensus among scholars on how to properly understand Fichte's so-called synthetic method. My goal in this paper is to closely examine the methodology Fichte uses in his first Jena presentation of the foundations of his Wissenschaftslehre and clarify the meaning of the synthetic method that he employs there. I mainly focus on the 1794-95 foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre and specifically on the first installment, so how Fichte himself calls it, especially on sections that deal with the presentation of the first principles and their foundational demonstration. In my paper, I argue that Fichte's conception of synthesis is not identical to Kant's and that the way he enacts the synthetic procedure in his first presentation of the Wissenschaftslehre points to his departure from Kant's usage of the synthetic method. What I suggest is that the way of proceeding Fichte uses to establish and to demonstrate his foundational principles can be properly understood only as a combination of methods construed dialectically, and that the synthesis he has in mind is not a simple unity of the opposing principles, affirmation and negation, the I and the not I, but rather dialectical resolution of the arising contradictions. On my reading, Fichte radically transforms the Kantian account of synthesis in at least three key aspects by reinterpreting its structure, its function, and the role of the subject in the synthetic process. Fichte's novelty with regard to the structure of the fundamental synthetic act is reflected in his concept of Tathandlung he uses to describe the self-referential and self-productive activity of human mind. Tathandlung is a triadic process and involves thesis and antithesis as its necessary elements. Without them, no synthesis is possible at all. As an act that furnishes this whole, as Fichte puts it, a thesis grounds the process, whereas an antithesis is responsible for differentiation that needs to be synthesized. This, in turn, also points to a very different function that synthesis has in Kant's and Fichte's systems. Kant describes synthesis as a spontaneous act, I quote, of putting different representations together and grasping what is manifold in them in one cognition. This is A77 B103. It is a process that he continues gathers the elements for cognition and unite them to form a certain content. This is A78 B103. For Fichte, the goal of the synthetic act lies not in the unification of the manifold of a given intuition, but rather in connecting the two elements posited in opposition to each other and unifying itself with its own differentiation. Fichte also goes beyond Kant in how he understands the role of the subject in the process of synthesis. According to Kant, a manifold of presentations that the synthetic act connects or unifies are given independently, and also both a faculty, the understanding that yields synthesis, and the categories by means of which manifolds of our representations are synthesized belong to the subject. For Kant, the subject is distinct from its representations. In contrast, in Fichte's system, the original synthetic act involves the power of productive imagination, by means of which the I unites the opposing elements, the I and not I, in the third one, a new concept, or concept of divisibility, which is also posited by the I itself. In other words, for Fichte, the I doesn't merely play a crucial role in the synthesizing process, but synthesis has its source in the I's acts of positing. This explains an internal unity of the triadic synthetic process and the very possibility of the synthesis itself. As Fichte puts it, I quote, "These terms that are the same would not be the same had they not first been posited as the same by means of a synthetic act." End of quote. Yet Fichte doesn't claim that we simply find the fully formed Tathandlung residing somewhere in our self-consciousness. Instead, we, so Fichte, constructed in order to explain ourselves to ourselves, to render intelligible to ourselves our normative nature as finite rational agents. The synthetic act is a constructive process. What it means that the relation between the I and not I is not theoretically assumed or merely presupposed, but actually constructed through the activity of the I itself, the activity by the means of which the I constitutes and shapes itself in the world of its own experience. In this sense, Fichte's synthesis has a crucial constructive function, which is correlative with the activity of the I itself. Approached from the philosophical or transcendental standpoint, the task of the philosopher is to bring the opposed elements into a unity by the means of a synthesis that will necessarily move the process to a higher level. Fichte thus tells us that, I quote, "Our entire way of proceeding from now on will be synthetic." End of quote. The type of synthetic procedure, however, that Fichte has in mind is nothing else but dialectical in both its conception and its execution. The dialectical qualification of Fichte's synthetic method is not limited only to its triadic structure, though, which is indeed often identified as dialectical one. Three other crucial features of Fichte's account of synthesis that point to its dialectical character are its focusing on a contradictory relation between opposing elements, relying on negation as a means of positing an opposition, and presenting a progressive process leading from less sophisticated conceptions of use to more sophisticated ones. If we consider how Fichte described the progression of the original foundational synthetic act, we will notice that the contradiction arising between the antithetically posited I and the not I becomes resolved only by positing a third element, the concept of divisibility, that eventually unite the initial two. The newly introduced element brings into existence a new concept, which eventually gives rise to a new synthesis that in turn grounds a new one, and so on. Fichte argues that a synthetic concept that unifies the opposed elements in a dialectically generated contradiction doesn't completely cancel the contradictory sides, but only limits, or as he says, determines them. Yet for him, a quote, to limit something means to nullify its reality by means of negation, not entirely, but only in part, end of quote. Thus, instead of leading to the dismissal of both sides of a contradiction, the synthetic concept retroactively validates the opposing elements by demonstrating their limit and by determining which portion of the reality pertain to them. In Fichte's system, the dynamic that sustains the progression of philosophical knowledge is in fact the activity of the I itself. This dynamic is posited from the very beginning in the very act of self-positing. It becomes most apparent, however, in the I's positing of the node I as not simply mutually exclusive elements by the means of pure logical negation, but rather as mutually determining each other, the relation of the Wechselbestimmung. Such a determination necessarily involves a limitation of each other's activity, simultaneously demonstrating its intimate connection. The I and not I mutually restrict each other's activity, causing some inertia of passivity, but at the same time, this mutual limitation makes them mutually dependent upon each other. This dependence is not absolute. It rather stresses the dynamic nature of relations between the I and not I. It is through the synthetic character of this dynamic involved in the mutual determination of the I and the not I that Fichte can introduce the distinction between the theoretical and the practical parts of the Wissenschaftslehre, exposition of which he devotes part 1 and part 2 of the foundation respectively. This is where he demonstrates the synthetic unity of the I proceeding from two opposite directions. First, he begins from the principle of the I positing itself as determined by the not I, the derivation of the theoretical part, and then from the principle of the I positing itself as determined the not I, the derivation of the practical part. Despite moving in opposite directions, both expositions employ Fichte's distinct synthetic method, manifesting its constructive power and dialectical dynamics. Considered systematically from the perspective of the development of the Wissenschaftslehre, the result of this very complex and often obscure demonstration is the synthetic derivation of all human experience and all knowledge from the original foundational principle of the pure I, common to both theory and practice. Radically reformulating the notion of synthesis in terms of the dialectical dynamics, Fichte thus makes it instrumental for the explication of specific issues relevant to our inquiry into the activity of the human mind. As such, it reveals a dynamic structure of representational consciousness and demonstrates the intimate connection between our subjective consciousness and its universal necessary features in all our cognitive activities. But what is more, the distinct synthetic way of proceeding that Fichte employs in his system underscores the dynamic character of the foundational presentation of the Wissenschaftslehre, which largely unfolds dialectically. While both Kant and Fichte claims to proceed synthetically and for their systematic presentation to employ the synthetic method, the meaning they assign to synthesis varies dramatically. In his deduction of categories, Kant begins with our most elementary experience and basic representations, attempting to synthesize manifolds of these representations in one cognition. He thus proceeds in ascending manner, progressing stepwise. And also cognition for him is synthetic in its character, structured by the unifying work of transcendental imagination and understanding. His synthetic exposition is a linear narrative. Fichte's procedure is manifestly different. For him, synthesis is present from the start at the original synthetic act of the I, yet it is construed in its most radical form of posited opposites. Also, the antithetic relation between the I and not I is contradictory in its character. Its distinct feature lies in the intimate interconnection and the direct joining of the two opposites. Such a disposition gives rise to the fundamental synthesis unfolding as a dialectical triadic procedure of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The philosophical significance of Fichte's dialectical synthetic procedure of reasoning lies in his ability to move beyond Kant, who in his transcendental dialectics claimed that reason's contradictions, antinomies of reason, lead to nothingness and thus cannot count as knowledge. In contrast, Fichte argues that the move to resolve contradictions with synthetic concepts is not only possible, but it is necessary and grounded in the original act of the I itself. There is, however, more to the story. Fichte's methodology is not limited to a radically new employment of the synthetic method. It also involves a specific appropriation of the analytic method. Starting with the existing original synthesis of the act fact, the Tathandlung or the agency of the I, Fichte has first to analyze that synthesis, discovering and recognizing its opposing elements, and then widening their position into a contradiction that becomes an antithesis of his synthetic triad. This intricate unfolding of the synthesis warrants Fichte's reliance on the analytic method and its employment for establishing the first two fundamental or foundational principles of his system. However, the analysis in question is not a typical analytic method as a genetic process that involves a logical analysis of concepts. Fichte's analytic method requires reflection and abstraction, which are interpreted as the self-referential activity of the I. The result of this activity is the self-awareness of the I and the recognition of its own self-constituting agency manifested through positing itself and its own negation in the antitetic relation. Understood in this way, analysis becomes a crucial part of synthesis, the component that actually exhibits its dialectical core, that is the contradiction of the antithetically posited elements that must be overcome, or more precisely reconciled, so Fichte, through synthesis. Fichte radically thus reformulates both the analytic and the synthetic method. The methodology he employs in his foundational representation of the system is a distinct combination of the two methods, where analysis becomes integrated in synthesis, and synthesis is framed as a dialectical way of proceeding. Fichte's synthesis approach or synthetic approach is thus inherently dynamic, and this dynamic correlates with the constructive activity of human mind. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that introduction. And I now pass the floor over to Christian Klotz.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Karin de Boer and the organizers of the seminar for inviting me. And of course, thanks to Marina Bykova for her presentation and above all for the illuminating and insightful paper. I agree with the central claims of the paper. That is, with the claims that, first, a specific philosophical appropriation of the geometrical style of argument is a distinctive element of Fichte's foundational presentation. That, second, Fichte's synthetic mode of proceeding in the foundation is not Kant's synthetic method, but instead a method that may be called dialectical and involves a transformation, a radical transformation of the Kantian account of synthesis. And third, that in Fichte's presentation of the foundational principles, the analytic and the synthetic method sustain and complement each other. Now, I would like to focus on some more specific issues that I think are worth discussing. My first observation concerns Fichte's appropriation of the geometric method. With regard to this, the paper claims that, quote, what distinguishes Fichte's model of geometric reasoning is its constructivist character. Now, even if we find in the foundation a deductive structure that may be understood to be an appropriation of the geometric style of reasoning, I doubt that we should characterize Fichte's methodological conception in the foundation as constructivist. To be sure, we may say that according to Fichte's account, the I constructs the synthetic structure of representational consciousness. However, this does not mean that Fichte understands his philosophical synthetic method as a method of a constructive mode of proceeding. And in some passages, he seems to say the opposite. Thus, in the fourth paragraph, Fichte says this, quote, hence, given the antithesis, we can infer the synthesis and can equally establish the third thing, in which the two opposites are united, not as a product of reflection, but as something found by it, als ihr Fund. It is, however, a product of that original synthetic act of the I. So, by means of the synthetic method, reflection finds the original acts of the I that underlie representational consciousness. And this doesn't seem to me to be a constructivist view of method. In a similar way, at the end of the 4th paragraph, and after having synthesized various versions of idealism and realism as opposed explanations of representation, Fichte says that now we do no more deal with facts that were, quote, artificially brought forth according to the rules of reflection through the spontaneity of our reflective powers, unquote. For now we have become aware of a fact that exists in human minds independently of philosophical reflection. Here, the procedure of synthesizing opposites enables us to become aware of a fact and to know for certain that this fact exists. So the sense of the methodic procedure is that it makes it possible to find something or to become aware of a fact. And therefore, I do not see a constructivist spirit, say in Fichte's methodological conception in the foundation. This method is rather a method of finding something or of becoming aware of something, of facts. In the second Jena version of the Wissenschaftslehre Nova Methodo, this is quite different. Here we have the conception of philosophical knowledge as obtained through a universally valid construction in intuition. So philosophical and geometrical knowledge are understood as being very similar. In the foundation, I don't see a methodological conception of intuition. My second observation concerns the evolution or development of Fichte's methodological thinking within the foundation of 94-95. In the paper, we find the following observation, quote, while Fichte's 1794-95 foundational account largely remains a work in progress, we do find there a distinct methodology. Now, I agree that there is a distinct methodology that guides the presentation of the foundational principles in the first 3 paragraphs. However, it seems to me that even under the aspect of its methodology, the foundation is a work in progress, and that in later sections of the text, we find methodological observations that are important for the question of what the adequate method for the presentation of the foundational principles is. Thus, in the 5th paragraph, after introducing the concept of striving as the synthetic concept through which the contradiction between the dependence and the independence of the I is resolved, Fichte makes an interesting observation about his, we may say, dialectical argument. Quote, that such a demand for absolute causality must originally be present in the I has been evidenced by the contradiction between the I as intelligence and as absolute being, which cannot be resolved without it. And this has furnished an apagogic proof. It has been shown that unless we are prepared to accept the demand for an absolute causality, the identity of the self will have to be given up, unquote. So Fichte here describes his dialectical argument, calling it an apagogic proof, because it demonstrates a principle by saying that if we don't accept this principle, there would be an unresolved contradiction. Therefore, the principle is true. And this may be considered to be an indirect apagogic proof. And now Fichte makes an important observation. Quote, this demand must also be capable of a direct and genetic demonstration. It must not only make itself acceptable by an appeal to higher principles, which would be in contradiction without it, but it must actually be susceptible of deduction from these higher principles themselves, so that we may perceive how such a demand arises in the human mind, unquote. Fichte here adds a new element to his methodology, the idea of a genetic demonstration. And he does so because he thinks that the dialectical apagogic demonstration has only a limited explanatory power. It tells us only that consciousness must be structured through a determinate synthetic concept, but it does not tell us how this synthetic element arises in the human mind. And the genetic argument Fichte now develops does not only refer to the origin of the demand for absolute causality, but also to what this principle presupposes, namely the positing of the not I and consequently the self-limitation of the I. For Fichte now argues that the I cannot be characterized only by its self-positing activity. It must also reflect on this activity and understand that the self-positing activity is its very essence. The I must posit itself as being posited by itself, Fichte's formula here. And this in turn requires that the I distinguishes itself from what it is not, from the not I. Therefore, Fichte concludes the I must leave itself open, as it were, to some other positing. I think only now, by virtue of the genetic argument, we can say that the self-positing activity of the I is internally related to the positing of the not I. In the first paragraph, I see no such argument. So there is a move beyond the dialectical method in the fifth paragraph, which is relevant for our understanding of the relation between the first three principles. So in this sense, I think also under the methodological aspect, the foundation is a work in progress. Well, my third and last remark is about the relation between Kant's transcendental dialectic and Fichte's dialectical mode of proceeding in the foundation. In the paper, we find the following observation, and Marina has also cited this now, quote, the philosophical significance of Fichte's dialectical synthetic procedure of reasoning lies in his ability to move beyond Kant, who in his transcendental dialectic claimed that reason's contradictions, the antinomies of reason, lead to nothingness, and thus cannot count as knowledge. Now, this is certainly true, but I think there is more to the relation between Kant's transcendental dialectic, that is the antinomies, and Fichte's synthetic dialectical mode of proceeding, and that we can understand Fichte's dialectic better by having a closer look to this. In the fourth and also in the fifth paragraph of the foundation, Fichte focuses more and more on an opposition that concerns the I itself, namely the opposition between the I's infinitude and its finitude. To resolve this opposition, Fichte introduces the conception of the wavering of imagination between infinitude and finitude. Now, as we know, Kant's cosmological antinomies concern the finitude versus infinitude of the cosmos under various aspects. So Fichte, as it were, shifts the opposition between infinitude and finitude from the cosmological context to that of the theory of subjectivity. And when, in the deduction of representation, he combines this idea with that of the mutual determination of the I and the not I, the latter being understood as the universe, he claims that now we can understand why the universe seems to us to be both finite and infinite. And he adds the observation, here lies the ground of the antinomies expounded by Kant. So Fichte does not only want to move beyond Kant's transcendental dialectic, he also wants to explain Kant's antinomies through his dialectic of the I and the not I. And this requires to bring into play the opposition between finitude and infinitude within the conception of the I. So I think the Fichtean dialectic is strongly inspired by and closely related to Kant's transcendental dialectic. So I leave it here. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thanks very much for those points and questions. So I'm quite keen to open it up to the audience, but before I do that, I'll pass the floor back to Marina. You don't have to cover everything in a comprehensive way. I'm sure we'll continue to discuss them in the audience, but if there's anything that you want to touch on now, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pavel. So thanks a lot, Christian, so for these thoughtful remarks and for so attentive reading of my paper. So I'm learning a lot about my own paper from your remarks as well. And this is so obviously a huge advantage here. Only a couple of things that I wanted to mention here. So you covered 3 points here. So the first, as I understand, this is the constructivist view. You are a little bit skeptical about it. So then the second about this early version of the Jena not even Jena, so early Jena version of the Wissenschaftslehre 1794-95, and whether Fichte does produce some very specific methodology here, or this is indeed just a work in progress. And the third one, this is about the relation between Kant's transcendental dialectic and Fichte's synthetic dialectical mode of proceeding. Now, couple things, kind of immediate reaction, right? So I absolutely agree with you that Kant was a huge inspiration and inspiration for Fichte. And Fichte obviously not only learned a lot from Kant, but actually he used Kant as a really basis, really very important basis for his own explorations and for his own kind of moving further in critical philosophy and so on. And I agree that there are many overlaps between Kant's own transcendental dialectic and Fichte's approach to the mode of presentation. However, I still believe that to some extent, Fichte is able to overcome some of the limitations of Kant's own transcendental method, because Fichte is able to introduce this element of dialectic. I am not claiming that Fichte's dialectic is akin Hegel's, for example, even though he uses the notion of negation, and notion of negation is instrumental to him, but this is obviously not Hegelian negation and not Hegelian dialectic. But at least, he doesn't refuse and doesn't reject the power of dialectic. And even triadic structure that he introduces in the Tathandlung, so these 3 foundational principles, we already see that he is able to overcome this, Kant's approach to dialectic as a negative dialectic, even though I realize that Kant has at least 2 different meanings of dialectic, positive dialectic and negative dialectic. But it seems that for Fichte, dialectic already kind of starts playing this more positive role, and he also sees the advantage of dialectical methodology, which for me at least, this is the step forward. So again, I realize that there are many overlaps here. I realize that we probably can't say that, okay, Kant is completely wrong and Hegel and Fichte is completely right, but I already see some progress here. And I need probably to mention here that I don't see the history of philosophy, especially the German idealism, as a linear progression. And I don't want to say that what we observe here is a linear progression from Kant to Fichte to Hegel. So they obviously move different direction, or at least we see the array of directions they are moving, right? So now about the constructivist view. I really appreciate this remark, because I now see very clearly where you're coming from, and actually probably a lot of readers, so when they see this terminology, so constructivist view, constructivist approach, they read it along the lines of more or less contemporary understanding of constructivism, which is not obviously what I meant here. So in this case, so constructivist approach for me is something like constructing the structuring, right? So structuring in some way. And this is why I introduce this discussion of the geometric method. So because I thought that it would clarify what exactly Fichte is doing here. I agree that this is still kind of work in progress. Yeah, so this is the early stage. He's still probing. He is not so sure as to whether this is the right methodology, but he is using this geometric method, or at least a geometric mode of explanation, right? So constructing the system in the way that it's really so very logical. And it also gives us a bit different perspective, because look, so if we consider Fichte's own approach, yeah, to foundational principles, so in order for him to justify the foundational principles, he starts with the rules and laws of the formal logic. So, and that by itself already creates a paradox here, right? So because his scientific philosophy, yeah, must be the foundational science. So the foundational science in the sense that it must serve as a basis, as a foundation for logic as well. But he begins with this kind of logical rules, logical principles, so the principles of formal logic, and then eventually he shows that these principles, they have to be deducted from, right, these foundational principles of his Wissenschaftslehre. So, this is why I meant by a constructivist view or constructivist approach. So to construct, right, to kind of logically structure the system. I'm not saying that his principle of self-positing is the principle of creating, yeah, producing something new. So this is, by the way, why then Brazil, right, and some others, they call this method phenomenological, right? Phenomenological method in the sense that this is the method of self-reflection, looking into itself, right? So the I kind of become self-aware, yeah. So this is more or less about self-awareness, awareness of itself, rather than discovering something new or constructing something new which is outside, yeah. But it's still constructivist approach for me in the sense that because the very notion and the concept of intuition is not developed yet. So like you mentioned, it will be developed in the Nova Methode, so much later, right? So for Fichte now, so the very important task, what he sees in front of him, is to explain how this self-positing possible, right? And again, it creates a lot of paradoxes here, because so he tells us we have to start with this spontaneity, but this spontaneity is not explained in any way, right? So, and then we have also some other dilemmas here. So he says, I can't do otherwise because I have to rely on freedom, right? So, and freedom is not justified, even though he talks about the first principle as the most self-evident, so self-explanatory, so not in need of any other justification and so on. So, and in this sense, I completely agree that this early version of the Wissenschaftslehre, so 1794-95, it's still so completely work in progress. At the same time, he already has some methodology. He already has some methods, so he doesn't adopt it, he develops it. And this is the point that I try to make here. He develops a method. Yes, obviously, he relies on something that has been done before, most importantly, Kant, yeah, but he moves forward. So it's not to say that, okay, he just applies it, right? So uses it. He develops this method. He already has this methodology. Another question is, and this is also a very important question, because when I started writing this piece, yeah, so I first thought that I would cover the whole foundation, so the whole work. And then I realized that after the first installment, the methodology completely changes, right? And then you have to explain the gap, because there is a gap, a real gap between the first installment and the second installment, right? And Fichte himself also realizes it, and he writes in one of the letters, a letter of his school friend, he tells him, okay, now I have to come up with some other method, right? So that would justify the move from the foundational principles to the logic or the structure of the whole system. So that creates another challenge for Fichte, and obviously it was a challenge for me as well. Okay, I will stop here. So thanks a lot. So it was really so very, very helpful to see this from another perspective. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much for that. So I look forward to the discussion. Sounds like we have a lot of things to talk about. The floor is now open, and our first question comes from Yelsha.
Hi. So thanks very much for the talk and the paper, and the response is really helpful to me as well. So I have a couple of questions. Maybe one is just a question of clarification, maybe that one first. So from how you now responded to Christian Klotz, is it correct if I then assume that what you think is that or what you understand as the constructive method in the foundations is not identical to what Fichte later describes as the method of construction? That would be my first question. The second one would be that what some people do is to say, like, that's in the foundations, there is a shift in method at some point, right? And especially in paragraph 4, before the deduction. And they describe this, or Brazil, for example, describes the shift as a shift between like something like dialectics and then something that is called pragmatic history of the human mind. And so I wasn't completely clear from your paper whether you can account for this shift or how you would do that by virtue of your description of the method. And then the third thing I'm interested in, if there's still time, is that you connect the experimental character of Fichte's method to its geometric character. And I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on how you think about that, or how that works out in your opinion. Yeah, so thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks. So interesting questions, so all three of them. So let me start with the experimental character, so which is absolutely right. So now I believe so I give it so in my paper, so some quotes from Fichte's letter exchange with his friend, where he says that this is kind of Fichte before he came to Jena, so kind of early Fichte, right? So where he is into geometry, and he believes that the only correct methodology or method so kind of explanatory method, right, and method of construction of the system would be geometric method. So what he meant by geometric is obviously Euclidean geometry, but at the same time, I believe that it was also some kind of reference to Kant as well, because so Kant distinguishes between when he talks about methodology, so this philosophical method and mathematical method. And under mathematical method, he also refers to Euclidean geometry. So, and it's interesting because at some point in his lecture on logic, so Kant also distinguishes between two methods, so method of geometry, method of algebra, right? Geometry, this is what proceeds synthetically for him, and algebra, this is something that proceeds analytically, right? So that creates a lot of problems for Kant scholars, obviously, because so there is a huge question how to understand Kant's distinction between synthetic and analytic, because he explains it so in a bit different way in his later work. So, and not necessarily the critique itself, even though so in critique, so he already applies this method, but rather in prolegomena. In prolegomena, where he distinguishes between two methods, so the method of the critique, first critique, and the method of prolegomena itself. But going back to this experimental character, I believe that first Fichte's approach, and actually first initial idea that Fichte had about the procedure, how to proceed in terms of the system, yes, this Wissenschaftslehre, so supposed to become the system, philosophical system, and the system of science, so to say, that his kind of initial thought was that the only true procedure could be the geometrical procedure. So now, at the same time, so he realized that the geometry per se and Euclid's geometry could not serve as a good sample. So this is why, this is my suggestion. So I don't know whether you would agree with this suggestion, but I believe that he rather relies on Spinoza and the structure of Spinozistic ethics than on the geometry like a mathematical science, right? So because so Spinoza was the first who actually applied this method of geometry to philosophy. What is interesting though, so that if we going back, so if we kind of think in retrospective, how the geometrical method was used historically, right? Geometrical method historically, or especially as it's applicable to philosophy or humanities in general, right? So it would be used in both ways, synthetic and analytic way. So because it would be possible to combine so synthetic and analytic approach. And it seemed that this is exactly what Fichte is doing here. So this is why, so actually it looks like so, and this is what he tells us, right? My method is synthetic, he says, right? But at the same time, when he moves from the first kind of principle of the system to the second principle of the system, or moves within the Stadthandlung, so this kind of synthetic act, so he changes, so he switches from synthetic to analytic, forth and back, because he believes that technically speaking, from the geometric perspective, it's something what is justifiable, right? And this is why I believe that if we want to understand better what this experimental character of Fichte's system is or was, right, at that particular stage, we need so also to take a closer look at his geometric method, or closer look at how he uses it, right? How he actually so makes it work within his Wissenschaftslehre, or at least so the early versions, or early Jena version of Wissenschaftslehre. Now, about the shift in method, yeah, I'm aware so of Dan's position, and even so I discussed it with him. And I agree that we do see a really huge shift. And this is what I meant by saying that there is a gap in between, right? Now, however, you know, so I am a little bit confused when people use the term genetic, when they say that the method that Fichte employs here is a genetic method, because then actually it suggests that he kind of adopts kind of linear approach, right? So, and this genetic suggests also kind of evolutive approach, so how it evolves, right? How it evolves by itself. And that this is another aspect of my understanding of constructive approach, or construction view, right? Because so in on my readings, on my reading of Fichte, Fichte kind of trying also to introduce some kind of another reflection. It's not only self-reflection of the I, yeah, so the I that reflects upon itself, but this is also philosophical reflection. So he tells us, we philosophers, yeah, we ought to reflect upon our own observation, upon our own experience. So to some extent, this is about the account of experience. And this account of experience is the experience of the I and also the experience of philosopher or observer, someone who is here to interpret, to translate, to comment, right? So to read it in some way. This idea of pragmatic history of human mind, it fits very well into a bit broader context, and I would say this broader context is the context of the German idealism as such, because traditional approach, especially the approach that was really very common, I would say at the end of the 20th century, now we're 21st century, right? So among German scholars, so they used to read German idealism, the progression of German idealism, as the history of self-consciousness, right? And in this sense, this pragmatic history of human mind is one of the chapters of this history. So again, like Christian, I myself also interested in the problem of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. And I myself, I always consider myself a Hegel scholar. This is where I started. I started as a Hegel scholar. And to clarify some of the notions so that we see in Hegel, and especially so Hegel's account of subjectivity and eventually intersubjectivity, so that brought me to Fichte, because I actually tried to understand what Fichte was doing and what this notion of the I or concept of the I is introduced there. And in this sense, I'm not so sure I agree with Daniel Brazil, right? So when he calls it the pragmatic history of human mind, what does it mean, this pragmatic history? From which perspective? Perspective of the mind itself or perspective of my philosophical mind, kind of external observer? So yes, again, so going back to your question, I agree that there is a shift. So, but for me, it's not just a shift. This is a gap that needs to be explained, and Fichte realizes it, and Fichte responds to it in Nova Methode. So this is his way to explain the shift. So he was unsatisfied, so based on his own exchange with his friends and his colleagues, he was unsatisfied with the shift because he with this gap, because he believed that everything has to be justified. And it wasn't, right? And it's still the question for me, what method he is using in the second portion, the second installment, second part of the foundation. And then so method of construction. So when you talk about the method of construction as Fichte used it, so right, so you probably refer to Fichte's later usage of the method of construction, right?
I mean, he also talks in the Zurich lectures and so on. He speaks of a method of construction in philosophy, but then notably in the foundations, he does not. And then again, later on, he describes what he means by a method of construction and so on and so on. That's why I was wondering, is it different in the foundations?
Yeah,
it's constructive, but not that method of construction.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for this clarification. I think that this is exactly what Christian had in mind. So because that was one of the remarks from Christian, that in the foundation probably, so there is this method of construction, at least so Fichte is not talking about it, right? So this method of construction is something that appears much later. So why would we say that this is constructivist view? And I try to explain that I assign a bit different meaning to this constructivist position, view, or approach. And actually, so this is my answer to this question as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And our next question comes from Yadi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marina and Christian. Thank you for the discussion. I have a lot of thought, and I will just try to formulate it clearly. I hope it becomes clear. So I wanted to begin maybe from Spinoza and the comparison between the geometrical method, because it comes from Spinoza, comes from mathematics, and I'm not sure about it, and I will tell you why. I think Fichte would consider such a method that we apply on philosophy from a different science to be something that is not developed from philosophy, and I think this is a difference between Spinoza and Fichte. That's how I understand it. That Fichte tries, and he says it a few times also in Über den Begriff and in the introductions, that his philosophy tries to let the content develop itself, and that's something that. So the whole discussion on method, I think, is a bit. I mean, for me, it's a bit confusing, because it's not something that we can take from one science and apply it to philosophy. I mean, at least not in Fichte, and I think also not in Hegel. And I think, for example, when he talks about synthetic and analytic method that he uses, so he says, for example, in section 4 of the Grundlage, that the Handlungen, the actions, are synthetic, whereas the reflection that observed this is analytic. So these two methods are actually two considerations of the same actions that we have. We once act, I mean, we once the eye posits itself, and once we observe this act in which the eye posits itself. And I think this analytic synthetic method, and he also uses other terminology to describe it. I think this is something that Fichte, as I understand it, is something that Fichte tries to let the concept themselves, or later the categories themselves, to develop themselves through this. And I think this is something that distinguishes Fichte from Spinoza, for example, or from the whole discussion of methodology as something that we think about methodology, and we think, okay, now we can apply it on the content of philosophy as something external. I think for Fichte that would not work, because he tries to do something else, as I understand it. But I would be glad to hear your thought about it, if that would clear.
Thank you very much. So this is a great question, and important as well. So a couple things here. So first, about Fichte's own approach. So for me, I distinguish between Hegel's and Fichte's approach. And I think what you just said, it's more closer to how I would view Hegel, for example, because for Hegel, it was very clear and straightforward from the very beginning that nothing from without should be introduced into philosophy. So this is the question of beginning, which becomes important for Hegel, and Hegel clearly states this question, the question of methodology. So he criticizes Kant, right? So because Kant, how he puts it, so actually tries to introduce whatever methodology from without, right? So, and this is what Hegel tells us in his Science of Logic, that so this being science, right? So it has to develop its matters and functionality from within rather than from without. I don't think that Fichte was so conscious about it. For Fichte, it was very important to develop Kant's critical philosophy, and he believed, so the whole career wrong, that this is what he is doing. And actually, he didn't play any games, right? So he seriously believed and sincerely believed that his own system, his own Wissenschaftslehre is nothing else but just a kind of updated version of the Kant's critical philosophy. That's it, right? Even though we know that the result is completely different. So his transcendental idealism is completely different. It's not exactly Kantian idealism. And I believe that Fichte was looking really very closely, so looking for how he puts it, not necessarily method, but the kind of style of demonstration, how he puts it, right? How to demonstrate the foundational principles. Yes, indeed. So for him, it's very important to demonstrate these foundational principles as being developed from within. But he needed to have some tools, right? Some methodology, how we put it right today. So to show it, to demonstrate it. So for these purposes of demonstration. Now, about Spinoza, yes, indeed. So Fichte is very critical of Spinoza, and this is not something unique to Fichte, the whole German idealism tradition, all of them. So they grew critical of Spinoza, so Spinozistic method, and also some of other ideas. But all of them, and especially Fichte, so Fichte was under spell of Spinoza much more than he himself would accept it to be the case. And this recent book, so by Giorgio Di Giovanni, so shows very clearly, so this impact of Spinoza on German idealism. And as I mentioned already, so Fichte was really so very serious about the geometric method. And he tells his friends and he tells so his students, and we find a lot of textual support for this one. So when he tells very clearly and upfront that the only method that allows to kind of logically develop the system and make it so rigorously scientific system would be geometric method. So he does use geometric method, and he recognizes that geometric method is foundational for him, at least at the early stages, right? Now, I see what you are saying, and I hear your concern that Fichte, who want his Wissenschaftslehre to be the most rigorous science, right? So it wouldn't make any sense, or at least so not a lot of sense, right? So to introduce some methodology from whatever other science or from whatever other discipline and introduce it into philosophy, hoping to achieve this result, to develop rigorous science. But what I'm suggesting here, I'm suggesting that it's not to say that he copied Spinoza, but Spinoza's applications of the geometrical method so served as a kind of sample, right, for him, that this is the most productive application of this mathematical methodology of mathematical geometric method, yeah, the method so that is usually associated with Euclidean geometry, right? So most productive application to philosophy and philosophical science. At least this is what I'm suggesting here, and I provide some quotations as well. So even so Fichte himself, who is critical of Spinoza, he recognizes the achievement of Spinoza, at least to this extent. Thanks.
Okay, our next question comes from Paulo.
Sorry, I'm at the library, so I'm typing the question in the chat. So
Okay.
maybe Pavel can help me read it, or
I'll read it out. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I see it's here now. So Paul is currently at the library, so he can't unmute himself. The question is, if Marina could elaborate a bit more on the methodological meaning of genetic. I think it pertains to showing a transcendental deduction of the various elements present in consciousness in order to explain both the subject's constitution of its surrounding world as well as the object of perception. But I'd like to know what the speaker thinks.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Yeah, I agree. So that those who believe that this is genetics or kind of methods that Fichte employs here, so that they usually kind of refer to transcendental dialectic and transcendental didactic, or deduction, so to say, right? So, and they talk more or less about very specific account of experience that Fichte introduces here. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about this genetic method, at least so in this kind of 1794-95, right? So work, because Fichte was not so concerned with the transcendental deduction yet. So his main concern, so here in this work, so is rather this foundational principles and justification of this foundational principle. The question of deduction, so transcendental deduction, comes a little bit later. And this is exactly the shift that we observe. So between the first installment and the second installment, so this is when kind of his goals, or at least so how he views these goals, they change, right? So, but first, and what I'm focusing on, so the material itself is a bit different and the goal is different. The goal that he pursues here, so is a kind of demonstration, really. So this is the word that he is using, the demonstration so of these foundational principles, which ought to be self-evident, self-sufficient, right? So not rely on anything else external and so on. And this is what is of interest to me, what methodology he's using here in this particular installment, right? Thanks.
Okay, our next question comes from Sergey.
Thank you very much for your refreshing report. I would like to ask your opinion on the Fichte's understanding of intersubjectivity, because I believe it's an important topic, especially regarding his methodology. So I would like to ask, are there any insights on how he uses this methodology, especially in his Grundlagen des Naturrechts nach Prinzipien der Wissenschaftslehre, I believe it's how it's spelled in German, where he tries to establish that it is required to have another I in order to establish the freedom of I. Thus, here comes the subjectivity. So what I want to ask is how Fichte deduces that other I, or rather he thinks of intersubjectivity as something a priori. And what do you think about the implications of the activity theories in Fichte's method? Does it means that without the activity of I, it is impossible to establish itself as a subject? Thank you.
Thanks, Sergey. So this is an interesting question. It's obviously a huge one, and we can discuss this question by itself, so probably for hours, right? Now, so for those who are not necessarily familiar with Naturrecht, right? So this is completely different work, and this is already kind of late Fichte, right? So this is not the work of, not the Jena Wissenschaftslehre. This is already so after Jena, this is Berliner side. And it has to do indeed with the problem of subjectivity, and most important with how to justify freedom, right? Now, so for me, and I already mentioned it, right? So that I came to Fichte from Hegel, And this is exactly the topic that got me interested, right? So subjectivity, intersubjectivity, because I wanted to understand how this idea of intersubjectivity came into existence, so to say, in Hegel. And in Hegel, so when we discuss intersubjectivity, we usually start discussing his phenomenology, and especially this passage on recognition, right? So master-servant dialectic. So, but this is obviously not the only passage and not the only work to consider. Most important, this is obviously Sittenlehre and Sittlichkeit, ethical life. So this is how we usually translate it, right? So, and it has so different levels and also different subtopics to include here. Now, going back to Fichte, so Fichte was one of the first thinkers, and maybe if we consider German idealism, the first thinker to suggest that intersubjectivity is the foundation for subjectivity. So there is no subjectivity without these intersubjective relations, right? And what he has in mind, so he actually tells us very clearly from the very beginning that in order for the I to recognize or to become aware of itself as the I ought to be engaged with other I's. And other I's for him, so this is not just epistemological subjects, but this is conscious individuals, right? And each of these individuals have their own claims, and these claims, they're claims of freedom. So actually, to translate it into plain language, what it means that for me to be free, right, I have to become aware of this freedom only then, or I can become aware of this freedom only then if I am engaged with other individuals who have actually similar claims as I am. Now, in terms of Fichte's methodology, I'm not so sure that it's directly related to synthetic or analytic or even dialectical method that we're talking about here, but it's obviously related and it's associated with Fichte's understanding of kind of social level, practical philosophy, right? So this is kind of, it belongs to the practical philosophy and the questions of practical philosophy. And to some extent, at least so how I read it, this is Fichte's further exploration of the meaning of the I. What is this I? Yeah, so it's not any more purely epistemological question, yeah, the question of cognition. So this is also the question of individuality or personality, right? So the question of how this consciousness or conscious individual becomes that individual. So this is why the question of subjectivity, so now for him is directly associated with the question of intersubjectivity. I probably will stop here, if you don't mind, Sergey, because otherwise we would probably need to talk about Fichte's kind of social philosophy or even more broader practical philosophy. Thanks.
Okay, our next question is from Karen.
Okay, Pavel, I thought you had yourself on the list.
I'll go after.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thanks, Marina. I thought this was very interesting, and I like the way you try to distinguish Kant's actual use of the synthetic method and his remarks on synthetic method from what Fichte is doing later on. But I think I would go a bit further into this direction and distinguish the two positions even more radically. Even though I also see, of course, also given Christian's comments, that there is a lot of continuity. And I think that with regard to Kant, I would strictly distinguish between the notion of synthesis, which refers to an activity carried out by the human mind, as you also discussed, and on the other hand, the synthetic method. And I think that in between these two types, let's say, of synthesis, the one is attributed to the human mind by Kant, and the other refers to the method that Kant himself employs in his capacity as a philosopher. So that, I think, needs to be strictly distinguished. But I had the impression that Fichte introduces a third type of synthesis, which is neither the one nor the other, but consists in this dynamic in which something posits itself, opposes itself to something else, and such that the opposition can then be resolved. And so, as Christian pointed out, this type of synthesis or synthetic method might have been developed from Kant's account of the antinomies, but it's definitely not something that Kant would refer to as a type of synthetic method. So if this is plausible, then we see how Fichte in a way operates with three types of activity, where the term synthesis is being used to specify what the activity is. And I had the impression that either you or Fichte collapses the distinction between the various types. Yes, where the term synthesis can be used to refer to the new type of method that Fichte introduces, or it can refer to the classical conception of the synthetic method to which Kant also refers, which basically means moving from principles to that which is based on these principles, yes, or moving from the ground to that which is grounded, rather than the other way around. And I think that I have the impression that Fichte preserves this classical conception of the synthetic method as well, yes, by saying, look, we need to start from a consideration of these foundational principles, and then go on and derive other contents or types of cognition or principles of cognition from these foundational principles. So also while reading your text, I was sometimes wondering whether either Fichte or you draw the same distinction between synthesis as something that is proper to the human mind on one hand, and the synthetic method on the other hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So I see what you are saying, and I hear your concerns. So in fact, I wouldn't say that Fichte introduces the third kind of sense on synthesis, right? So, and this is why, because what you probably understand under this certain sense of synthesis, so this is the unity between thesis and antithesis. So this is actually so kind of synthetic approach. So what Fichte himself also discusses in terms of dialectical approach or dialectic. Now, first, let us consider Kant. So Kant, as we know, described the synthetic method as one going from principles to consequences, while the analytic method for him goes the other way around. And in other ways, so what he's doing, he identifies these different directions of philosophical argumentations with a progressive and a regressive procedure. But in Kant as well, so we find some other distinction, right? So, or senses, right? So, and in this sense, so he inherits kind of traditional approach as well, because this distinction between analytic and synthetic method was not Kant's own invention, as we know, right? And it was already discussed before, even by ancient mathematicians, and commonly used by Kant's modern predecessors and contemporaries. So this is when synthetic was often associated with the geometric procedure. So this is procedure of Euclidean geometry, and this is the reason for me to include this particular discussion in my paper as well. So which starts from definition, axioms, postulates to obtain theorems and problems, right? So, and then analysis or analytic method that was usually associated with algebra. And this is something that Kant uses as well. So kind of different senses of synthetic analytic methods, or different kind of appropriation of the tradition and also his own approach. Now, you suggest that in Fichte, we see at least three different senses. So first, this is the traditional kind of Kantian approach to some extent, right? And you suggest that Fichte inherits this approach and he doesn't change anything. So he just uses it in some other ways, because sometimes he introduces an analysis or analytic method as a part of the synthetic, or kind of mixes both of them. And then the second sense, it would be the sense of synthesis. So synthesis, how it's applicable to the mind, right? How mind synthesizes categories, concepts, ideas, and so on. And then finally, what I mentioned at the very beginning, so synthesis, this is where he discusses this Kant's antinomies. Kant tells us that this is illusions of the mind, and Fichte kind of shows us that synthesis is possible, and for him this is the synthesis, nothing else but the unity, kind of unity that obviously involves this overcoming of the opposition of thesis and antithesis. Yeah, I understand and I appreciate it, and probably you are right, so that we should distinguish here between synthetic method and synthesis, right? So this is two different concepts, two different categories. But first, I think that even though Fichte obviously influenced by Kant, and he uses to some extent Kant's terminology, still, for him, the synthetic method, how he understands it, is not Kantian synthetic method in terms of just the procedure, how to proceed, so what to start with and where to go, right? So for him, synthetic method, so this is very special activity, and this is why I'm talking about methodology, right? So this is the activity on our part of the philosopher, how philosopher, right? So how philosopher proceed with this demonstration. So he talks about the demonstration, yeah, how to demonstrate these foundational principles. Now, the term synthesis or synthesizing, yeah, synthesis in terms of the activity of the mind, yes, it's something that he uses here, obviously, and I agree, and I appreciate that you point this out. But the third, as you suggest, the third meaning or the third sense, when synthesis, so it's something that is connected or to some extent refers to Fichte and antinomies, I would say that this synthesis, so it's a bit different. It's something that Fichte as well, so he calls dialectical. Yeah, so dialectical moment. This is how he introduces it. So I would say, just to summarize, that, yeah, we can distinguish between the two, and probably, and I agree, so, and I appreciate it again, so that you bring it to my attention that we should be very careful distinguishing between synthetic method and synthesis as activity of mind. But I would suggest that the third sense of synthesis, this is not exactly what Fichte actually considers a synthesis in terms of specific meaning. It's rather kind of reconciliation, right? So reconciliation that he understands as the unity. Okay, now I'm thinking that maybe we can use it as a kind of functionality, as a functional term, right? As a functional term, but I wouldn't say that Fichte collapses this distinction. That might be my fault, obviously. So I collapse the distinction between these meanings, but I think that Fichte is really very clear about the differences between these two.
Okay, thank you very much, Marina.
Okay, Luis.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Marina. It was very illuminating, the paper, and also the discussion with Christian and with all the others. So I have two quick questions. One about synthesis. So Karin was just mentioned this distinction between synthesis and syntactic method, and I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between this, so to say, geometrical strand of Fichte's method and the syntactic one? Because you mentioned at some point that, look, even geometry for Fichte is syntactic, but when you describe synthesis, you do it as Fichte does it, as a synthesis of opposites, as a synthesis that involves negation and contradictions and so on. So is geometry syntactic in the same sense? Do we have negation? Do we have oppositions? It's not, right? So what does synthesis mean in the context of geometry for Fichte? And the second question is, you mentioned a couple of times a shift in Fichte's methodology. And it's rather a clarification question. Do you think that the shift is from the part of the principles to the theoretical part? So from paragraph 3 to 4, or from paragraph 4 to 5? Because Brazil and others, they mentioned that there is a shift from the theoretical to the practical part. But I take you to be saying now that there is a shift from the principles to the theoretical part. And if you could say a little bit more about this specific shift. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Luis. So, yeah, I see what the question is. So, and yeah, so now when I was introducing and was discussing the geometrical method, I was using it more or less in terms of the kind of tool, right? Tool of how to structure the argument, right? So it's a rather kind of logical tool. So why my explanation is so that because Fichte wanted to explain, to develop philosophy as a rigorous science that is foundational for everything else, for all other disciplines, including logic, he would reject the very idea of using logic, right? So as a tool to develop philosophy. This is why, so to some extent, yeah, so I agree so with this comment so from JD that actually, so what does it mean? So we are using something completely external, not necessarily belonging to philosophy itself, and we're introducing something external into philosophy. So my own reading so of Fichte that he doesn't consider it as an external, he considers rather as a procedure, right? Procedure that I, an observer or philosopher, use in order for me to demonstrate these foundational principles. In this sense, I see what Karin is saying, and I agree with her that this is kind of first layer or first sense, right? Or first connotation of the synthetic. Synthetic method is a procedure, right? As a procedure, so as I, philosopher, use in order for me to proceed, right? In order for me so to proceed in my exploration and in my demonstration. Explanatory means, so to say, right? So now, when we move to the Wissenschaftslehre itself, within the Wissenschaftslehre, so the synthesis, so this kind of term synthesis has very specific meaning. And this is what Fichte introduces when he talks about triad and kind of movement from thesis, antithesis to synthesis, right? He understands synthesis as the unity, is not Hegel's understanding of synthesis. So we know that Hegel never uses the triadic structure, never uses even this terminology, yeah, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. One of his explanations is that exactly because before him, the word synthesis was used as a kind of pure unity, and this is not pure unity. So Fichte doesn't have the notion of Aufhebung. Fichte doesn't understand this Aufhebung, and the unity or the synthesis is not the Aufhebung for him, right? It's completely different story. So even though we're using the same term dialectic, so in case of Fichte, so this is not Hegelian dialectic yet. And it's really very far from Hegelian dialectic. And it's already not Kantian dialectic. So Kant also uses the term dialectic. So this is one more thing to consider. And this is why I agree with Karen, so that we should be very careful. So in terms of how we use this terminology, right? This is about the synthesis. What was the second one, Louis? Sorry.
It was about the shift from paragraph
shift,
4 to 5.
Yeah. So shift. So this is a huge question, and I believe that this is a huge question for all Fichte scholars, right? Especially those who are working on this early kind of Jena period Wissenschaftslehre. So for me, the shift is not necessary between theoretical and practical part, right? The shift, so how I see it, so I see the shift exactly so between the paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. Why? Because so these first 3 paragraphs, this is where Fichte is concerned with the demonstration of the foundations of his system, right? And once he finished demonstrating, so this is, he believed that he already done with the demonstration. So there is a shift in methodology, there is a shift in goals, there is a shift in task, in everything, right? So this is why, so for me, this shift, so introduces really so very huge shift in terms of the task to be done. So this task is still understood in terms of the justification, but this justification is not anymore justification in terms of the foundational principle. Now, this is a justification of the content, what to include in the Wissenschaftslehre, right? And therefore, so he changes his methodology as well, or at least so the task of methodology, how he views it. First, it was kind of demonstrative approach to demonstrate the foundational items, to demonstrate that they are foundational. And now when he believes that he already so accomplished it, now he needs to demonstrate how it's possible to deduct or deduce all the content of the science from these foundational items. And in this sense, so I personally, I believe that the shift is between the paragraph 3 and the paragraph 4, but I am aware that many believe this is 4 and 5, so this is between theoretical and practical parts.
Okay, maybe very briefly, I'll ask about construction. So I'm quite curious about what you had to say about construction, because it's something that I'm working on now, not in Fichte, but another philosopher. And also based on the discussion, it's clear there are a lot of strands in the concept of construction. There's the contemporary constructivist strand, the geometrical strand, the Spinozist, the methodological one, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to ask about the Kantian strand, because you originally introduced in the paper construction as a development of Kant and as an attempt to put Kantian mathematical construction on the basis of intellectual intuition. So I want to ask what that Kantian strand has to do with the other ones that we've been discussing, and how it's supposed to work actually. Because the way I understand the Kantian construction, mathematical construction, is that it's the process of ascribing marks or properties to a concept based on how an object is presented in pure intuition. And you have a right to ascribe those properties to that concept because the object can't be presented in any other way. right? So like the angles of a triangle all add up to 180 degrees. There's no way that that cannot be the case. So you can construct the concept based on that presentation. So you actually construct the concept, not the object. And you need a medium of a pure intuition because it doesn't work in any other medium. For example, in sensible intuition, if I intuit a red car, I can't construct the concept of car because I don't know if redness belongs to the concept of car or not. So it seems like it only works for a priori intuition for Kant because that's the only medium that can give the legitimacy to the properties that you ascribe to the concept. So I want to ask how it works with intellectual intuition, because I mean, observing myself, how does that give me the right to somehow construct a concept in this sense? Yeah, and how it relates to these other senses of construction.
Yeah, thank you, Pavel. So again, this is a big question. It's important, perhaps the most fundamental question for German idealism altogether, right? But my kind of first initial reaction to this question, so just to begin with, right, that for Kant, so the first and most fundamental construction or constructive act is the construction of our own experience. So because this is exactly the account of experience is central question for all of them. So for Kant and then for Fichte, so they are actually dealing with this particular question, the question of the account of experience, right? So Kant tells us that actually what are the conditions of the possibility of experience and knowledge, yeah? So this is something what depends on the structure of the mind, yeah? So space and time, for example, there's pure forms of intuition. So this is already a kind of way for us to construct this experience. So we construct the framework for us to perceive the reality, yeah, to intuit the reality. So the same we can say about our own intuition, internal intuition. So Kant reject the very idea of the kind of intellectual intuition, so which is kind of intellectual intuition, right? So, but he still believes that we have some idea of ourselves, right? And this some idea of the ourselves is to some extent transcendental idea in us. So this is, again, for me, the most fundamental constructive kind of action on our part is the construction of our own experience, construction of the framework for us to have experience, to have knowledge. And this is how I understand it. So I can refer you, again, you can disagree with this position, but to Tom Rockmore, for example, and Rockmore, so this is his position. So he believes that we can discuss and should discuss the whole German idealism, even in terms of the constructive approach. So this is all of them. So actually, this is what they produce here. So this is kind of constructivism view and constructivist perspective as such.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And thank you for the talk today and for your attendance. And thank you to Christian. So we'll wrap up with this final question. So thank you to our audience, to our speakers. I want to invite you to our last session as well of the seminar, which is on May 18th, and it will be a book launch on the Opus Posthumum. I'll just paste the schedule in the chat, so everybody is warmly invited, and then there will be another session in the following year. This is the final one. And yeah, thank you again, everybody. Thank you to Marina Bykova.
Thank you very much. So thanks a lot for attending the session. So thanks for inviting me. So for being so active, for participating, asking questions, very interesting questions, very engaging questions. And again, so thanks to organizers, so Karen, Lewis, Pavel, and many thanks to Christian as well. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to Christian for coming and posing some really stimulating questions and generating a lot of interesting debate, which I think we can continue informally after the session. So thank you, Christian, for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so see you next time, everybody.
Thank you.